Picture this. You're a desperate peasant in 15th century France. A messenger arrives at your hovel with an offer that seems too good to be true. The great Marshal of France wants to hire your young son for his household. Good wages, fine clothes, maybe even an education. You kiss your boy goodbye, never knowing you've just handed him to history's most notorious child killer. Welcome to the story of Gilles de Rais, the man who stood beside Joan of Arc as she crowned a king, then spent the next decade systematically torturing and murdering children in chambers that would make modern horror films seem tame. But this isn't fiction. This is the documented account of how medieval France's golden boy became its darkest predator. By the time this story ends, you'll understand how a war hero transformed into a monster so depraved that his crimes still echo through our nightmares 6 centuries later. And the most terrifying part? He almost got away with it. To understand the monster, you need to understand the man. Gilles de Rais was born in 1405 with everything medieval society valued: noble blood, vast wealth, and unlimited potential. His family controlled massive estates across Brittany and Anjou, making him one of France's richest men before he could even grow a beard. But wealth wasn't enough for young Gilles. He craved something more intoxicating: glory. At 16, he threw himself into the 100 Years' War with the enthusiasm of someone who'd never seen a real corpse. And damn, was he good at killing. The kid had a natural talent for warfare that caught everyone's attention, especially when he started collecting English heads like trophies. Then came 1429, the year that changed everything. A peasant girl named Joan of Arc appeared, claiming God told her to crown the Dauphin as king. While most nobles dismissed her as a madwoman, Gilles saw something else. Maybe it was her conviction. Maybe it was her courage. Or maybe he just recognized a fellow fanatic. Whatever it was, Gilles threw his considerable wealth and military genius behind Joan's cause. What followed was medieval history's greatest comeback story. Gilles fought beside Joan through the siege of Orleans, marched with her to Rais, and stood beside the throne when Charles VII finally got his crown. At 24, Gilles de Rais was everything medieval society worshipped: wealthy, brave, loyal, and blessed by God himself. The church made him Marshal of France, the highest military honor possible. He was living the ultimate medieval dream. But dreams, especially those built on violence, have a nasty habit of becoming nightmares. Joan of Arc was captured by the English in 1430. A year later, she burned at the stake as a heretic. For most of France, Joan's death was a tragedy. For Gilles de Rais, it was the end of his world. The man who once charged into battle with religious fervor suddenly withdrew from public life, retreating to his sprawling estates like a wounded animal. But instead of healing, something inside him began to rot. Gilles started spending money like the world was ending tomorrow, throwing banquets that lasted for days, staging theatrical productions that cost more than most kingdoms' annual budgets. The real red flag? His sudden obsession with the occult. Gilles began collecting books on black magic, hiring supposed sorcerers and alchemists who promised to help him contact the dead. Not just any dead, he wanted to bring back Joan of Arc. His servants whispered about strange rituals in the castle's lower chambers. Locals reported seeing mysterious lights and hearing unsettling sounds from his properties at night. The man who once fought for God was now apparently making deals with the devil. And then children started disappearing. At first, it was just 1 or 2 from villages near his estates. Poor families would send their kids to work at the castle, hoping for steady wages and maybe a chance at a better life. But these children never came home. When worried parents asked questions, Gilles' servants gave vague answers about kids being sent elsewhere or given better opportunities. The local authorities, intimidated by Gilles' wealth and status, looked the other way. After all, who was going to challenge one of France's most celebrated war heroes over a few missing peasant children? But the disappearances followed a pattern. Young boys, usually between 8 and 12, often with fair hair and delicate features. Children who reminded him of something, or someone, from his past. The hero of France had become a predator, and his hunting ground was getting bigger every day. What happened next takes us into the darkest corners of human depravity. The events that unfolded within Gilles de Rais' castle walls weren't random acts of violence. They were systematic, ritualistic, and planned with chilling precision. Gilles developed a sinister recruitment system. He dispatched his most trusted servants to nearby villages with enticing offers: employment in the castle, education for promising boys, or even positions in the marshal's personal choir. These weren't random kidnappings. They were carefully orchestrated deceptions that preyed on desperate families' hopes for their children's futures. The servants knew exactly what they were looking for. Young boys with specific physical characteristics, fair-skinned, delicate features, innocent expressions. Children who fit Gilles's increasingly specific tastes. Parents, desperate to give their sons better lives, trusted the Marshal of France without question. Once inside the castle, these children entered a nightmare disguised as paradise. Initially, they were treated like honored guests, given fine clothes, elaborate meals, and comfortable quarters. They probably thought they'd won the medieval lottery, but this kindness was just another layer of Gilles's psychological manipulation. The true horror began when Gilles revealed his real intentions. According to testimony from his own servants, he would lead the children to secluded chambers deep within the castle, rooms specifically designed for what was to come. Stone walls that muffled screams, heavy doors that locked from the outside, and furnishings that served purposes no civilized mind should contemplate. His servant, Etienne Corillot, known as Poitou, provided chilling testimony about Gilles's methods. He described how the marshal would restrain the children, preventing their cries from being heard, then commit acts so unspeakable that even hardened medieval courts struggled to record them. The killing methods varied according to Gilles's mood and the specific ritual he believed he was performing. Sometimes it was decapitation with a short, double-edged sword he kept specifically for these purposes. Other times it was slow strangulation or dismemberment. The common thread was that death was never quick or merciful. But death wasn't the end of Gilles's perversions. It was often just the beginning. Court records, based on confessions from his accomplices, reveal that Gilles would engage in disturbing interactions with the corpses. He would kiss the bodies, examine severed heads and limbs with what witnesses described as paternal affection, and sometimes keep the remains for days to continue his macabre rituals. The most disturbing aspect was how Gilles treated these murders as performances. He would sometimes dissect the bodies while the children were still alive, reportedly finding amusement in their final moments. His accomplices testified that he seemed to derive as much pleasure from the psychological torment as from the physical acts themselves. The castle's furnaces worked overtime disposing of the evidence, bones, clothing, personal effects. Everything that could link the missing children to Gilles's chambers was systematically destroyed. The efficiency was terrifying. These weren't crimes of passion. They were industrial-scale murder operations. Conservative estimates place the number of Gilles's victims at around 80 children. More extensive calculations suggest it could have exceeded 200. This reign of terror spanned nearly a decade, with Gilles's crimes becoming increasingly elaborate and depraved over time. What made these murders particularly chilling was their ritualistic nature. Gilles wasn't just killing children, he was conducting what he believed were religious ceremonies. He would force victims to participate in mock religious services before subjecting them to torture. He treated their suffering as a form of worship, their blood as a sacred offering to whatever dark forces he believed he was serving. The psychological profile that emerges from these accounts is terrifying in its complexity. Gilles wasn't a mindless killer. He was methodical, patient, and absolutely convinced of his righteousness. He saw himself not as a monster, but as a scholar of forbidden knowledge, using innocent blood to unlock supernatural secrets. The occult dimension of Gilles's crimes transforms this from a simple murder case into something far more disturbing. Gilles genuinely believed that the blood of innocent children held magical properties. He wasn't just killing for pleasure. He was conducting what he considered scientific experiments in supernatural power. His obsession with alchemy and demon summoning wasn't separate from his murders. It was their primary motivation. Gilles convinced himself that by sacrificing children in specific rituals, he could transmute base metals into gold, summon demonic entities to do his bidding, and even resurrect Joan of Arc from the dead. The children's suffering wasn't incidental to these rituals, it was essential. Gilles believed that terror and pain amplified the magical properties of innocent blood. The more a child suffered, the more powerful the ritual became. This belief turned him into a connoisseur of agony, constantly refining his methods to maximize both psychological and physical torment. Medieval documents describe elaborate ceremonies where Gilles would invoke demonic names while children died. He would collect their blood in ornate vessels, mix it with exotic substances, and use it in alchemical experiments that promised to unlock the secrets of immortality and unlimited wealth. The most disturbing aspect was how Gilles integrated Christian imagery into these blasphemous rituals. He would force children to pray before he killed them, not out of mercy, but because he believed their final prayers would enhance the magical potency of their deaths. He was essentially weaponizing their faith against them. This wasn't random superstition. Gilles had assembled an extensive library of occult texts and employed several supposed experts in demonology. He approached child murder with the same methodical intelligence he'd once applied to military strategy. The result was a system of ritualistic killing that was both psychologically sophisticated and absolutely evil. By 1440, Gilles de Rais had made the mistake that would destroy him. He ran out of money and started threatening the wrong people. His decade-long spending spree on occult experiments, theatrical productions, and maintaining his increasingly elaborate murder operations had drained even his massive fortune. Desperate to maintain his lifestyle, Gilles began selling off family lands and borrowing heavily from the church. When creditors came calling, he responded the only way he knew how, with violence. The final straw came when he kidnapped a priest who was trying to collect on church property, holding him for ransom in direct defiance of ecclesiastical law. That was the moment the church and local nobility, who had been quietly tolerating whispers about missing children, suddenly had a legal excuse to bring down France's most inconvenient war hero. The missing children provided the criminal charges, but the kidnapped priest gave them the political cover they needed. The trial that followed was a medieval media circus. Gilles faced charges in both ecclesiastical and civil courts: heresy, sodomy, murder, and kidnapping. The prosecution presented a parade of witnesses that included his own servants, local parents, and even some children who had somehow escaped his castle. The evidence was overwhelming. Over 100 witnesses testified about the disappearances. His own servants provided detailed accounts of the murders, describing specific victims and methods with horrifying precision. The sheer volume of testimony from independent sources made a complete conspiracy almost impossible to orchestrate. But here's where the story gets complicated. Some modern historians argue that while Gilles was probably guilty of murder, the scale of his crimes might have been exaggerated. Think about it. He was massively wealthy, politically connected, and had dirt on half the French nobility from his military campaigns. His creditors included powerful bishops and nobles who stood to inherit his lands if he were convicted. The timing of his arrest, right when his debts were mounting, seems suspiciously convenient. The confession that sealed his fate came only after he was threatened with torture and excommunication. Medieval justice wasn't exactly known for its constitutional protections, yet Gilles himself seemed to embrace his guilt with disturbing enthusiasm. During his confession, he provided graphic details about his crimes that weren't necessary for legal proceedings. He described his methods, his motivations, even his feelings during the murders with a level of detail that suggests either genuine guilt or the performance of a lifetime. The court found Gilles de Rais guilty on all counts. On October 26, 1440, he was hanged and then burned at the stake in Nantes, in front of a crowd that included many of the families whose children he had murdered. His last words were reportedly a prayer for forgiveness and a warning to other young nobles about the dangers of excess and vice. But death wasn't the end of Gilles de Rais' story. It was the beginning of his most lasting transformation. The man who had once been France's golden boy became its most enduring bogeyman. His crimes were so shocking that they transcended history to become legend. By the 17th century, French storytellers had begun weaving his crimes into folk tales. The wealthy nobleman who murdered children in his castle became the inspiration for Charles Perrault's Bluebeard, the fairy tale about a rich man who kills his wives and hides their bodies in a locked room. The details were sanitized for children's stories, but the core remained. Power plus secrecy equals horror. Modern criminologists studying serial killers consistently point to Gilles as one of history's first documented cases of organized, ritualistic murder. His methods, the careful victim selection, the escalating violence, the psychological manipulation, read like a textbook on criminal psychology written 600 years before the field existed. What makes his legacy particularly disturbing is how it reflects the dark side of medieval heroism. The same traits that made him a great knight, ruthlessness, lack of empathy, absolute belief in his own superiority, also made him a perfect predator. Medieval society created the ideal conditions for his crimes by celebrating violence and giving unlimited power to men who proved they could use it effectively. The psychological profile of Gilles de Rais became a template for fictional monsters that still haunt us today. The charismatic leader hiding unspeakable darkness, the respected member of society who preys on the vulnerable, the man who uses wealth and status to enable his crimes. Every compelling villain since has borrowed something from the Gilles de Rais playbook. The story of Gilles de Rais forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about power, justice, and human nature. He wasn't some obviously deranged madman. He was a celebrated hero who gradually transformed into a monster while society looked the other way. The most chilling aspect isn't that he was evil, but that he was evil while fitting perfectly into his society's definition of greatness. His crimes succeeded not because he was clever, but because he was protected. Wealth, status, and political connections created a shield around him that made the disappearance of peasant children seem irrelevant to authorities. The same systems that elevated him to heroic status also enabled his transition to systematic child murder. Today, his story serves as a permanent warning about what happens when society gives unlimited power to people who were never meant to have it. Every culture has its potential Gilles de Rais, respected figures whose dark secrets are protected by power, wealth, and willful ignorance. The man who once stood beside Joan of Arc had become something far more enduring than any saint. A reminder that the most dangerous predators aren't the obvious ones lurking in dark alleys, but the ones standing right beside the throne, wearing medals and earning applause. Whether Gilles de Rais was history's first serial killer or just the victim of medieval politics, his story forces us to ask the questions that matter. How do we identify monsters before they're fully formed? How do we protect the vulnerable from those who would exploit them? And most importantly, how do we ensure that heroism never becomes a license for horror? The chambers of Gilles de Rais have been silent for 6 centuries, but their echoes still reverberate through every story of power corrupted and innocence destroyed. His greatest crime wasn't just murdering children, it was proving that sometimes the monster and the hero are the same person, and the only difference is which face they choose to show the world. In the end, the most terrifying lesson from inside those chambers isn't what one man was capable of doing, but what society was willing to let him do, as long as he kept his medals polished and his reputation intact.